seem like you could be a U.S. Marshal to requisition somebody and get him to where they need to be.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Before we get started with Bob and the panel and thanking Obama, I'd like to thank you all for attending the Conference on World Affairs. I hope that everyone is having a wonderful time. I think Bob is going to have an amazing panel, more than enough to talk about. I just wanted to give a quick notification that at the end of this session, as always, ushers will be having donation envelopes. If you'd like to contribute to the CWA, we always welcome your participation in all of its various forms. Your old car, your neighbor's old car. So thank you so much for attending, and please enjoy the panel.
So this is my microphone on? Can you hear me? No. Get real close. There we go. Thank you. So this is Thursday, April 13th at 12:30 p.m. If you're not on a flight to Chicago, please exit now. This is panel number 4452, entitled Thanks, Obama. And before we begin and before I introduce our illustrious panel, I wanted to do a little survey real quick. I want to see how many people think the name of this is Thanks, Obama. Just raise your hand. And how many people think it's Thanks, Obama? I thought that might help our panel get a little flavor of what we're dealing with here. So it's as usual, our format will be we'll have about 10 minutes each for our panelists to have an opening statement. We'll have about a 15-minute session where they grill each other and ask each other questions, and then we'll open it to questions from the audience for about 30 minutes. Have all of you been using the app to figure out how to ask questions, I hope? Because I'll be trying to catch your questions on the moderator's app, and so hope you'll be asking questions during the event. I'm glad that Ellie made it here. I would love to introduce the panel at this point.
It's a big campus.
So first up, to my immediate left, is Michael Franc. He is a Hoover Institution director of the Washington, D.C. programs. This is his 14th time at CWA. I think that deserves... He is widely quoted in the media and the press. He served as Vice President of Government Relations for the Heritage Foundation. Michael, thank you very much for joining us this year. Next up is Ellie Schafer. She served as the Special Assistant to Obama and Director of the White House Visitors Office. I wish I'd known her back then, could try to sneak in somehow.
There's no sneaking in the White House.
I was amazed to see that she managed some 1,500 events, 4.5 million visitors over that 8-year period. I didn't get a chance to check with her, but maybe she'll share what her favorite event was of that 8-year period. Ellie, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And then our cleanup batter today is Mark Fallon, a very popular panelist. He is an international security consultant. This is his second time here at CWA. I asked him, he's a counterintelligence specialist. I was saying, can I just follow you around in your life for a week or two? I think that would be absolutely fascinating. He's the author of a book called Unjustifiable Means, the inside story of how the CIA, Pentagon, and U.S. government conspired to torture. Mark, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
So without further ado, let's begin. Thanks, Obama, and we'll have Micheal lead off. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. It's 14 years, and as much as I like all you guys, you still haven't gotten to me yet. Right? I'm still conservative. One thing I thought I'd do is lay out, if you've heard me before, you know I kind of like throwing around a lot of numbers and a lot of trend lines. And if you think about having 8 years at the helm of the federal government, you maybe want to think, has any of the trajectories of whatever trend line moved in one direction or another in any noticeable way beginning somewhere around 08, 09? Like what's the, maybe the impression? Is it going to be continuation of a previous trend? Is it going to be reversal of something? Is there some kind of great numerical, self-evident accomplishment that might stand out or not? So let me run through a fair number of these things, and I'm the domestic policy type, so I'm going to focus more on measures of well-being and government involvement in these areas and that sort of thing, and leave it to others to get into more detail about the national security foreign policy legacy. So let's start, and one thing I'll try to do is give some of the trend lines that was before he came into office so you can see some of the context, okay? So for example, to those of you worried about income inequality, right? One of the things that did happen over the last at least 15 or so years, if you start looking at it, is an enormous increase in the total wealth in the country, even including the recession. So in 2000, total net worth was 44 trillion with a T. By 2016, it was 90. Interestingly enough, from 2000 to 2008, the increase was 43%, from 44 to 63 trillion, and then from 2008 to 2016, 43%, from 63 trillion to 90 trillion. One thing that I noticed when I was looking at this is you had this once in a half century or century kind of recession. It's been a long time since we had a recession as bad as what we had from 07 to June of 09. So what you expect to see a lot of times is bad numbers reflecting the unemployment increase, the drops in GDP and that sort of thing, and then a rebound. And the rebound usually takes a few years to get back to the pre-recession level, and then you have the normal kinds of continued growth. When you have government interventions, you're expecting to see a spike in people getting help in some area, the SNAP program, Medicaid, the workforce statistics show some kind of a snapback. And then when the recession's over, some of these increased numbers of people getting assistance will fall back down to a pre-recession level, okay? And that's something that we don't see, which I'll go through real quickly. So some more things here. Some experts have been referring to this as a lost decade. So from the recession, it took 4 years for the GDP to reach the late 2007 level. By 2016, the increase was only 12%. On a per capita basis, it took 6.5 years to get back to the pre-recession level. And by late 2016, on a per capita level, it was 4% higher, which is very, very low by any historical standard. One kind of canary in the mine is the Congressional Budget Office when they calculate what kind of growth you get when everything is in full throttle, all the pistons are churning and all that. They lowered it to 1.7% GDP growth. It's sort of almost an ideal growth rate, which is way below what most economists would expect and say that we need to deal with things like entitlement, spending crisis that's coming in the future, and so on. Employment. The one big storyline is the civilian employment rate, which is basically the ratio of jobs to population. From 2000 to 2016, went from 64.6% to under 60, 59.7, so a 5% drop, which is over time the worst record in the post-war era. And again, it's an example where there was a negative trend prior to the recession. You had the recession, and the negative trend just continued. So you didn't get a pushback up again after the recession. The exodus from the workforce, one commentator said that in the 21st century, America has witnessed a dreadful collapse of work that predates President Obama, but has continued sometimes with a vengeance during the 8 years he was in office. So the adult work rate now is the lowest in over 30 years. For every unemployed man between 25 and 55, and think of the Trump voters here, there are 3 others who are not working or even looking for work. So they don't even come up in the statistics when you read about the unemployment rate. So you almost need to refashion how we calculate this stuff, because that dynamic has gotten, that trend has gotten a lot larger and a lot worse. And it affects women as well. Paid hours of work from 85 to 2000, it increased by 35%, but from 2000 to 2015, only by 4. So this is one of these, again, predating Obama, but nothing really altered that trend line during the 8 years. Let's see. A couple of other things. If you look at, I like polls. If you look at right direction and wrong direction polls, that's good, pretty good barometer, temperature take of the American people at any given time. Gallup does these things about every month or so. So in the 8 years he was in office, they did 107 of these polls. The highest right direction response was 37%. Only 10 times out of 107 times in those polls did it even go above 30. So that means that in 97 out of 107 months, fewer than 30% of the American people thought we were heading in the right direction as a country. So that, and a lot of those months, obviously, are post-recession months. So people weren't really feeling it. And that's, for any politician, any commentator, that's sort of another canary in the mine. There's something that's not quite working out according to plan. Trust in institutions since the 70s has been a pretty steady erosion in the level of trust in just about every category of institutions that Gallup surveys. And that continued, again, for the last 8 years, usually about 3 or 4 more point decline in trust in institutions, with a few exceptions. In fact, the trust in the presidency went up a few points, so that was a positive one. It went up for police, and it went up, I think, for small business, and maybe 1 or 2 others. Health. So let's spend a couple of seconds on this. How many of you are familiar with the Angus Deaton Ann Case study on morbidity? Came out, and he's a Princeton Nobel Prize winner, and his wife, Ann Case. And they looked at morbidity trends, and they did it by country and also different demographic groups within America. And this is a study where they found that among all whites 45 to 54 years old, between 1998 and 2013, there was a reversal. There was an increase in morbidity, going in the wrong direction. Life expectancy went down. For those without a high school, without a college diploma, the drop was even greater. And when you looked at it in detail, the sources were largely 3 things: suicide, opiate overdoses, and liver failure, which were all kind of, they call these now the deaths of despair. There was a Brookings paper came out this past week with an updated version of their study that's worth looking at. CDC reported life expectancy went down by 1/10 of a year from 2013 to 14, and that's the most recent numbers they had reported. Another group, the Human Mortality Database, which is an international organization that tries to reconcile different nations' measures of this stuff, say that our decline has been, or we've been stable or going down since 2012. So it's been, for them, a little bit longer period. Some studies, for example, this opiate thing is horrible, and I really encourage you to read into it and learn more about it. There's one study that, there's a book called Dreamland by Sam Quinones. Have you ever heard about that? And he reported how over a 3-month period in Ohio, 11% of all Ohio residents were prescribed opiates. There's a fellow, Alan Kruger, who was, I think, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, did a study, and he found that nearly half of all male labor force dropouts, which is over 7 million people, are on painkillers. And one of the problems with that, as Quinones pointed out in Dreamland, is that most of these opiates are prescribed through Medicaid and paid for through Medicaid. And there's a $3 copayment, and you can get these very, very expensive pharmaceuticals that have addiction rates up around 25%. So that's really fueling a lot of the problem. Poverty rates, again, no real changes. In 2008, it was 13.5. 2015, the most recent year, 13.2. I can go on, with some of those. Same thing with disability program and with SNAP. And the SNAP one is worth looking at. Congress tried to grapple with that one when I was up there recently, to no avail. But the costs, for example, and the enrollments were steadily going up until the recession hit a peak of 33.5 million people, $53.6 billion. And then it jumped in 11 to 75.7 billion in 2013, 79.9, and stayed above 70. So it didn't snap back down, so to speak. It stayed up and leveled off in the high 70s, even many, many years into a recovery. And that's the problem you run into. You see some of these programs, they're really, really hard to unravel once people get accustomed to being in them, even when the economy is growing, even when there's month after month after month of employment growth and some GDP growth, as modest as it was, those numbers should have been coming down and coming down fairly dramatically, and they didn't. So I'll leave it at that, but the main point I would suggest is that as much as people were trying, and their hearts are all in the right place, the nature of how we've decided to engage to try to help people in trouble in this country has not been working out as well as it should, and I think we can all do better. Thanks.
Ellie, do you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, I'm more of the thanks Obama category. So, for me, I just wanted to just kind of talk a little bit about my journey a little bit, and then we can kind of talk about the politics so you can understand where I come from. Is that I started working for Barack Obama in 2006 on his Audacity of Hope book tour, and then went into the campaign from day one, ran all through the campaign, into the transition, and then at the White House. My last day at the White House was the 20th of January. Stepped foot in the last time on the 19th, and then went out to Andrews Air Force Base to say goodbye as they boarded Air Force One for the last time. So I have a very different perspective of how life is under, or was under, President Obama. But I also kind of agree that a lot of times that for every study that somebody can find, I can find another one. And I think that one of the things that's very important now is that we actually just sit down and talk and listen to one another, and really try to solve the problems and come to understand where everybody's coming from. And so I'm a fan of the Affordable Care Act. I'm a fan of marriage equality. I'm a fan of the Detroit bailout. There's a lot of things that I'm a fan of that I think actually help this country. But I do think that, like, standing up here and arguing over it, which is not something that I want to do, because that's not my style at all, is not necessarily what we're up here for, or what I'm up here for. So I just kind of wanted to give you a background a little bit of that, and then I think probably as we get into the questions, I can answer more. And there's no way I'm gonna top those facts either. So.
Ellie, do you want to just address a little bit, say, the high level of the tone of the White House that Obama brought to bear? It was interesting, actually, Mike, one of your statistics was the approval rating of the presidency was one of the few things that actually went up. But do you have a quick comment about that?
Sure. I think a lot of times, and this is simply my opinion, I think a lot of times when you're trying to change something, and you're trying to change something that's ingrained, whether you are Republican, Democrat, whether you are, a disruptor who's trying to upturn industry or try something new, there's resistance with that. And oftentimes, especially like in civil rights, and other times, it's often 2 steps forward and 1 step back. There is challenge. There is, as things move forward, and the dust settles, I think then people start to end run around legislation and things like that. I think that the overall tone of the Obama administration was to truly make this country and this world a better place to live, and to help those who needed help. And it was positive. It was moving things forward. It was moving the country forward. It was sitting down and listening to folks. It was doing things like the Affordable Care Act, which everybody knows and everybody has admitted is flawed. But now, hopefully, fingers crossed, things like pre-existing conditions will not be an issue anymore. Hopefully, we have pushed things so far forward that when you're talking now about subsidies or you're talking about other regulations, things like pre-existing conditions aren't going to make healthcare unaffordable for folks. They're not going to kick you off a plan. You know, they're not going to make people scared to go to the doctor. And I think that a lot of times when you're making change and you're making big change, you ruffle feathers. And, you know, your choice is to go along and not ruffle those feathers and say, this is the way it's always been, and we don't want to get people too upset. Or you go in there and say, this has got to change. And, you know, people can't live this way anymore. And I am no expert on the Affordable Care Act. I can just use a family reference, is that my nephew has type 1 diabetes. And after the Affordable Care Act came, my brother's insurance policy was cut in half. Because his type 1 diabetes was no longer a pre-existing condition. And so we've seen the benefits. And so I think in that, though, in change, you ruffle feathers. And a lot of people then, you know, don't like it. And I think that's where kind of a lot of the tone comes in with the lower approval ratings and things like that, that you have to get in there if you're going to, you know, if you're going to rip out the guts of something and start over. It's not a pretty process, and you're going to ruffle feathers along the way. So I will say, though, that the tone of the White House is one that is genuinely of good and thought the best of people and thought to really make this country and this world a better place to live. Okay.
Mark, it's your turn.
Well, thank you. Well, I spent 31 years with the government, and I never worked for an administration. I worked for a government, so my perspective will be a little different than Ellie's or possibly Mike's. I don't have the stats Mike has, but I'm going to cite some laws and some other events that I think might be interested to the Thanks Obama panel, however you would like to put the inflection on that. So on December 10th, 1984, the United Nations adopted a thing called the Convention Against Torture. It was by unanimous agreement, and it entered into force on January 26, 1987. The United States was an active and effective force behind the conventions, calling for a significant step in the development of international measures against torture and other inhumane treatment and punishment. The core provision of that act was to establish a regime for international cooperation in criminal prosecution of torturers. Relying on a thing called universal jurisdiction, each state party that signed up to that is required under law to either prosecute torturers within their territory or extradite them to countries for prosecution. On May 20th, 1988, Bob Kaufman will be happy with this, Ronald Reagan and the 100th Congress ratified the convention as a treaty under U.S. law. There are now 161 state parties that have signed to these conventions, and they are now accepted as customary international law, and violators can be tried before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Torture is defined as severe physical or mental pain and suffering. It also bans a lower threshold, just as the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution does, cruelty, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. The absolute provisions for the provisions against torture are absolute. It actually says there are no exceptional circumstances whatsoever that may be invoked to justify torture, including the threat of war, internal political instability, public emergency, or terrorist acts. Ronald Reagan said, "The United States will demonstrate unequivocally our desire to bring an end to this abhorrent practice of torture." In the wake of September 11th, President George W. Bush instituted a calculated policy of state-sponsored torture, and he did so in your name. These were policies bred from fear, ignorance, and arrogance. CIA black sites and DoD battle labs were created, and prisoners were tortured in the name of the American people. We tortured the guilty, and we tortured the innocent. The torture that was administered was designed by psychologists to maximize the psychological suffering of the suspects. The level of human degradation is hard to imagine, but it happened. In many cases, the medical personnel not only designed it, but helped administer the torture. Many felt safe that it was done in secret and that no one was ever supposed to know. The public was never supposed to know what was done in your name. At the time when I saw this gravitating from the CIA to the Department of Defense, and I was told it was secret, I said there are no secrets. There are only delayed disclosures. The world was aghast when Abu Ghraib photos were aired on 60 Minutes. We couldn't believe the level of degradation that our soldiers would treat prisoners in our custody. It was against what we stood for, the Geneva Conventions, which we were a party to ensure were enforced to protect our service members. Congressional hearings ensued. Senator John McCain enacted the Detainee Treatment Act in 2005, saying we will adhere to our responsibilities in the Geneva Convention. We will comply with the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, the 4th Amendment of the Constitution. The report showed that the torture techniques had been spread from the CIA to the Department of Defense and on to Abu Ghraib. The report also revealed that the Department of Defense failed to hold those responsible accountable. On January 20th, 2009, President Barack Hussein Obama was sworn in as the 44th President of the United States. 2 days later, he issued Executive Order 13491, ensuring lawful interrogations. He disbanded President Bush's orders to create the RDI program that included the EIT program that you may have heard of, which is the excuses to inflict torture. And the very next day, and I applaud him for that, so for 13491, thanks, Obama. The very next executive order he signed, 13492, said we're going to close Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, because it was a symbol of torture. And what we found, having been on the inside, is the number one reason and number two reasons that foreign fighters were coming to the battlefield was Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. At the time, however, Obama was naive. He didn't realize the extent the torture was ongoing, and he didn't realize that it permeated every one of those prisoners involved in the global war on terror. While there were calls at the time for accountability and for us to comply with our obligations under the Convention Against Torture and our own United States laws, President Obama said we need to look forward, not backwards. He created a policy of impunity for torture. He set the stage for those tortures and the torture lobby, the torture advocates, to continue to mislead the public, to continue to mislead the Congress, and to continue to mislead the media about what they did in our names. They falsely claimed success, self-aggrandized that they were keeping you safe. They didn't. They made us less safe. In December 2014, the Senate Intelligence Committee, in a bipartisan study, released the torture report, the executive summary, 500 some odd pages that showed the depravity in which we treated people. Reading that a few times, I had to put it down. I just couldn't keep reading it, knowing what people who swore to protect our Constitution did to prisoners in our custody. The public was misled, as the report said. The Congress was misled. The president was misread. The media was misled. And each of you was misled about what was needed. And the report cited that. The torture lobby has continued the campaign that they were just trying to keep the American public safe, when in fact they did the opposite. When Donald Trump ran for president, he ran on a war crimes platform. He said, we're not just going to waterboard, we're going to do worse than waterboarding. In his first week in office, President Trump drafted an executive order that was leaked to the media because he wanted to reinstitute the CIA black site program and drive us down back the abyss towards torture. Who knows what other actions have been planned in secret or maybe ongoing right now? President Obama's policy of impunity for torture has left us vulnerable to slide right down the slippery abyss to commit war crimes in the name of the American people. So for that, I say, thanks, Obama. It's not just your legacy at stake, it's ours. Thank you.
So we have on the table some domestic statistics, and we have a pretty grim picture of foreign statistics there. Who would like to see how to pull some of this together? You know, one of the first questions that I saw pop up on my phone was from a student. How do you think President Obama changed the political landscape in the United States? That might be one way of addressing for me, the question is, what is the legacy of the Obama administration? It's a little early to say, but how do we get our hands around this? I'd love to see how each of the three of you would respond to that. And please feel free to ask each other specific questions.
You guys are the political folks here. Why don't you guys start?
I mean, on the politics of this, the statistics have been out there for a while in terms of just who controls which chambers and what the change in the seats were by party over that 8-year period. And if you know, at one point when I was working for Kevin McCarthy, the House Majority Leader, I think it was after the 2014 election, I just thought visually, let's do a pyramid where the presidency's at the top, and then the Senate and the House below them, and then governors, and then state legislative chambers. And basically, if you did that, and you did it broken out by red and blue, the colors of the two parties, I guess, what you basically saw is the further down you went on that pyramid, the more red you had. And over 8 years, there was a total of about 1,000 state legislative seats that switched from Democratic control to Republican control. Republicans are at these 100-year highs at the state level in terms of those kinds of metrics. So 68 out of 98 of the chambers, which Nebraska is a nonpartisan chamber, so we have 98. 68 of the remaining 98 are now in the hands of Republicans. That's a real big increase from where it was in 08. I think it's 33 governors' mansions are in the hands of Republicans now. When you go to the House, they dipped down a little bit in this 16 election, but they were pretty much in the last couple cycles at the highest level they've been since the 1920s. Senate, there's been a small majority they've had for a while, but it's not the highest they've had, but it's a majority. And then you had the presidency was obviously in the hands of the Democrats. But it was doing something about the way things unfolded in Washington. The irony is the presidency went up in that Gallup survey I mentioned by a number of points. It was not insignificant as far as, you know, admire a great deal or somewhat. Congress went down, right? Yet it wasn't as if that rubbed off on people in the president's party further down the political food chain. So you can have another discussion about why that happened, how it happened, where it happened. But at a national level, it happened, and it happened in a historically significant way.
I, no surprise, think that history will look very favorably on the Obama presidency. I do also believe, like a lot of times, like when we were talking about Congress, you know, everybody hates Congress, but they love their congressman. You know, and that there's a disconnect, right, between Washington and back home. And there's a disconnect between, like, well, that's not my guy. You know, that's not my girl. That, you know, that's everybody else. And so, you know, there's some kind of interesting dynamics. I think Congress was at like 2% or some, you know, there was some like ridiculously low.
There was a point where John McCain said our approval rating now is so low, it's been reduced to our staff and immediate family members.
Yeah. Yet everybody kept getting reelected. You know, so it's always kind of an interesting, you know, phenomenon when you talk about, you know, why this happens and who's to blame and you know, the finger pointing that goes into it. But I think that, you know, a lot of times when you see a party take control of the White House, there's sometimes a sweep, there's sometimes an anti, you know, it's like, well, I'm going to vote for this side, but not this side. And, you know, and so I think you can see that over various presidencies, not just the Obama administration. But I do kind of think it's one of those things when you just mentioned Congress, you know, is sometimes it's an all-time low, but everybody's congressman keeps getting reelected. So, but I personally think that history will look very favorably on the Obama administration. I think that In addition to a lot of the international policies, I think domestic policies, there was a lot of push towards making things equal, whether that was marriage equality, whether that was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, whether it was the Affordable Care Act. There was a lot of things in there that were pushed to level the playing field. And I think that, his presidency will be looked on favorably for that.
And I'll now speak as a victim of politics. Yeah. So if you look at Guantanamo Bay, a place that I've been many times and I know very well, the moment the first detainees started arriving at Guantanamo Bay, we realized that we didn't get who we told we were going to have. I was the chief investigator for Al-Qaeda for Trials Before Military Commission at the time, and I was waiting for the worst of the worst. And unfortunately, that's not who we got. We got people that we paid bounty for, the governmental equivalent of human trafficking, in people who really, most of them did very little. We had been up to, at one point, almost 800 detainees at Guantanamo. We're down to 51 now, only 10 are slotted for trial. A portion of those, 41 now, are actually cleared for release. We're just trying to figure where to send them to. So from those almost 800 worst of the worst, we have about 10 we're bringing to trial. And from the onset, from 2002, my task force was about 230 people, investigators, analysts, lawyers, psychologists, you name it. We were trying to downsize the population. The administration, the Bush administration's policy was, this is a temporary facility. We're not going to build any real permanent structures because we don't intend to keep these people here long. It's just going to be a place where we're going to exploit those. The initial intention was those were of high value to exploit them for intelligence, and were of high value for prosecution. And my job was the high value for prosecution one. And so we were spending an inordinate amount of our time trying to do risk assessments on those that we were having to release because we were trying to downsize the population to a manageable level at the time. And as you moved forward, President Bush wanted to close Guantanamo. President George W. Bush wanted to close Guantanamo. We were trying to downsize it to a manageable number so we can figure out what to do. There was bipartisan agreement during the campaign that Guantanamo needed to be closed because you had John McCain running and Barack Obama running. And so it was bipartisan that wanted to happen. Colin Powell said he would have, when he was asked, he said, when would you close Guantanamo? He said, yesterday. So what happens is President Obama gets elected, and all of that support from both sides to close Gitmo all of a sudden shifted to now we need to keep Guantanamo open. So all those on the right suddenly no longer felt all of those justifications that they had up until that point that we needed to close Guantanamo and downsize it. And now we have another administration who I fear is anchored to a position that we're going to send some more bad dudes there. We're going to keep it open. We're going to go back to torture. We're going to do all these things. So the politics of that will continue to plague us, and it will still stand as a symbol of injustice, torture, and oppression based on politics. Thank you.
So let's stay on foreign policy for a minute. One of the questions, and this is kind of a matter of style. One of the questioners said Obama sought congressional permission to fight a war in Syria, where Trump doesn't seem to be inclined to do so. Do any of you have any thoughts on particular style of how it's early in the Trump administration, but how we're leading our foreign policy?
So we actually have a foreign policy regarding that? I mean, that's the problem here. What does success look like? I mean, as a person who's worked on invasion plans and other things, you need to start with an end in sight. So what is your strategy? What will fill the vacuum? What is your intended outcomes? And then what might be unintended consequences or unanticipated consequences to the direction you're heading? So until we have a comprehensive strategy on Syria, it's hard to determine whether tactics like 59 cruise missiles is an effective tactic unless it supports a strategy. It might be a good tactic, but we don't have a strategy. Right now, we're going to struggle with that strategy because any strategy is going to have to involve Russia. And we're not sure how far Russia may have infiltrated people within the White House. And so until that issue is resolved, until we determine who might be closely affiliated with Russia or Putin, whether people within the White House or closely connected have committed acts of treason against this country, it will be very difficult to come up with a comprehensive strategy against Syria because somehow we need to deal with the Russia.
I can't top that one, so I agree.
Syria is, I used to think when I was growing up that the geopolitical situation in Northern Ireland was like a recipe, a pure, perfect scenario for not being able to unravel anything. And between the Christians and the Catholics and the Protestants and the geography involved and the different aspects of their economies and so on, and 700 years of history with the British overlay, it just seemed like it was a perfect, petri dish case of how to create a unsolvable mess. And then Syria comes along, and that seems to be a whole lot worse and a whole lot more complicated. My limited observation here is that on Labor Day weekend in 2013, we all got called in to work when I was on the Hill to deal with what was expected to be the president's request for authorization to do some things in Syria, when of course he walked back from that red line, that moment. And one thing I took away from that was it was an across-the-board gasp by both Republicans and Democrats, at least in the House where I was situated, that they'd seen the administration and John Kerry was given assurances run up to the edge of this. And the question was not whether but how such a request would come over the transom and when we would be able to process it, how quickly the committees could work and that sort of thing. And then at the last minute, with all the world watching, he pulled back. And if you talk to some folks, for example, where I am now at Hoover, former secretaries of state, former ambassadors, and so on, they all say that sent a signal that was really, really hard to undo, that's still wreaking havoc and causing trouble to this day. Because it sent a message that the United States was going to talk tough but never quite act on that at the end of the day, and thereby emboldening a lot of the nasty people in that region who want to claim territory, to do harm to certain groups, and so on. So, I think just as a counter, I'd never seen serious foreign policy experts so aghast, and it wasn't just a bunch of conservatives after that happened, because you kind of have to back up your word, and it was a very, very clear statement about what that red line was and how it would trigger, if you violated it, some kind of serious response to the United States.
And I will say, just to follow up on that one, is that I think that the president acknowledged that. I mean, when President Obama was giving one of his farewell, interviews, and I can't remember if it was George Stephanopoulos or another one that he was talking to, he had said that it was one of the biggest mistakes that he made was walking away from that red line. So I think it was something that everybody acknowledged. It's not like his head is in the sand about it. So
That's good.
So let me read a couple of similar follow-on questions here. The first one is, do you think that Obama's foreign policy wasn't criticized as harshly as it might have been? And they put in here heavy zone strikes, continuation of Middle East conflict, etc. And a similar question, by the way, I think you know that we're collecting questions on cards too if you're not using your cell phone. Thank you for that. This one says, how do you compare or contrast the capture and interrogation of combatants under Bush versus the 563 drone strikes during the Obama administration versus 57 for Bush? Anyone want to take that friendly question?
Yeah, there has been, and there's a lot of debate within my community about drone strikes, targeted assassinations, and other things because whether we like it or not, we have used drones for targeted assassinations against American citizens. Anwar al-Awlaki from New Mexico, who did Inspire magazine, I mean, an inspiring al-Qaeda member in AQAP, the most dangerous branch of al-Qaeda to the United States. So we had used that as a tactic in supporting a strategy. Whether you like it or not, whether it's right or wrong, it happened. From a intelligence professional perspective, one of the things that does is it eliminates your ability to extract intelligence from those people. So you lose a vein of data that you might get with a capture as opposed to a kill, and those, frankly, go into the planning stage. When you're planning a find, fix, and finish operation, you are trying to determine what that outcome may be. So the concern is when you use an indiscriminate drone as part of your warfare, what does that do to the rest of the population that might be impacted by the use of drones hovering over and taking people out as a instrument of warfare? And so the problem is, I spend a lot of time watching Yemen because I also worked the Cole attack, so it's an area that I'm pretty familiar with. And so the concern is when you do that, how many more adversaries might you be creating by taking that one out if there's more collateral damage? And so when I follow on Twitter a lot of journalists who are on the ground in Yemen, and the reports from them seems to be much different than the reports I'm hearing from CENTCOM or JSOC about indiscriminate kills and collateral damage. And so with the drones particularly, that is an area that is inspiring quite a bit of folks who had been tribal in nature, and they are shifting to more being violent radical extremists against us just because of a policy. And I'm not, you can debate whether it's right or wrong. They use drones too. They just use human beings as drones. So they strap a bomb to a body and walk them in someplace and blow them up. We just happen to do it from a mechanized platform. Sorry to bring down the crowd.
Let's switch a little bit to the economy here. There's a number of you are asking questions about the economy. One says, Mr. Frank, how can total net worth grow so much with anemic GDP growth since 2008? All due to investments? And a sort of similar question, during Obama's years, the wealth of the Koch brothers, for example, tripled from $17.8 billion to over $50 billion each. Don't they owe Obama thanks?
Yes, they do. I think the way the statistics are calculated, it's total worth. So you can have you may have a stock that goes from being worth $100 to $300, but if you haven't cashed it in, if it's just a paper worth, that's going to show up in the worth column, but it won't contribute to GDP. Okay, so you can get that kind of disparity. And the question is correct, I think, in assuming that most of that growth occurred in real estate and in equity holdings by a very high, relatively small number of very high wealth individuals. It's another way of saying that economic inequality increased quite a bit during these years as well, especially in certain, like in the coastal areas. That's where it seems to be concentrated.
Either of you have any further thoughts on that? How many of the statistics by Mr. Frank about the slow recovery from 2008 were the result of Republican Congress denying any Obama proposals stimulus for infrastructure or employment?
You guys remember the stimulus bill is $800 and some odd billion in 09, right? What was the expression? Was it President Obama said that A lot of those projects weren't shovel ready, but eventually the money was spent. Stimulus didn't really have much of an effect. Depends how you spend it too. I mean, a lot of this money was being shoveled to states and to other kinds of entities just to, bulk up bureaucracies and try to help them cover holes from the revenue holes from the recession. There were people being hired to put insulation in houses, and how efficient or how inefficient that was and what that contributed to GDP, I have no idea. But stimulus has never been that popular in general as a way to increase economic growth. If you're going to spend money on stimulus, spend it on things that really need it. There's a lot of bridges, a lot of roads, a lot of, maybe mass transit systems that need to be rehabbed. Try riding around Washington, D.C. these days. It's a relatively young system, but boy, it needs a lot of help. Those things might have a real impact that's measurable, but a lot of the other kind of things that were being spent on, mainly buttressing, state and local bureaucracies and other kinds of entities like that, didn't have much of an effect on the economy. So why do it again over and over?
I mean, I have a little bit of a different opinion in that I think that part of the stimulus program goes into communities and builds up communities. So it might be installing installation, but it's in a community, that's a job, and that money, trickles down. So that allows somebody to purchase more groceries, purchase, gas, purchase, clothing, things like that. And so I actually think that actually goes into communities and builds up communities, and you start seeing the increase in the economy from the ground up and not being pushed down.
Well, it's a quick response. George W. Bush tried that too, and they tried it in the form of checks. They had a couple $100 billion going out in the form of, I think, $250 checks or whatever they were. And the studies of those indicated that they didn't make any difference either, because it's a one-time only thing. A lot of it goes into savings. It's not repeated. The kind of stuff that makes a difference is when you give people additional incentives to work, save, and invest at the margin. So that's why things are so hard politically, because at the margin means that your last dollar earned. So for wealthy people, it's a relatively high level, and you need to take down the government's take of that last dollar earned to encourage the person to actually maybe work harder, do overtime, take a second job, or whatever. So if you, absent doing that kind of thing, which tends to yield economic stimulus, just throwing money at people or dropping it out of helicopters, or as John Maynard Keynes once said, paying one person to dig a hole and another person to fill the hole back up. He actually advocated that. And there have been economists more recently who defend that. Personally, I don't think that does a whole hell of a lot of good. I don't know if anyone here would like to pay one person to dig a hole and another person to fill the hole back up. Anyone here want to do that? I mean, seriously, and this is John Maynard Keynes. And how many people here are Keynesians? Not as many hands as I expected. I think I shamed you all into keeping your hands down.
A couple of more questions in the similar vein. One of you asked, what attempts did the Obama administration make to address the infrastructure needs in our country? And the second one is, why is the auto bailout never mentioned when jobs were saved? The comment here was, without the bailout, jobs would have been lost. Any thoughts on the auto bailout or infrastructure investment?
I have a feeling that neither Mark nor Ellie will want to comment on that right now. But anyway, the bailout, one thing about the bailout, how many remember the way in which it was conducted? You know how in a bankruptcy proceeding, the law establishes different levels of priority for who gets paid first when you start to unravel a bankrupt entity. And bondholders, I believe, are at the top of that chain, the food chain. And what they did is they essentially, with no legal authority, reconfigured that. So I think the UAW got a big chunk of change, and the bondholders who had invested with that understanding that if the company were to go bankrupt, they would actually recover the maximum amount of their investment relative to other people in line. They didn't get it, and that was one of the earliest, I think, make up as you go along situations that that I would criticize the Obama administration for having become habitual offenders on. They did a lot of it on Obamacare too, but that was a feature of the bailout. How many jobs it saved, it may actually be that it kept some companies in business, but I think there was a sacrifice in the way the rule of law was undone there. On infrastructure spending, one of the problems is the regulatory reviews that are accompanying most of these projects. And for example, I'll give you one example in the highway bill from last year. There was a senator, freshman senator, and happened to be meeting with him that afternoon, and he had come back from the Senate floor. He was really kind of tickled because he had offered his first amendment. And he offered an amendment saying essentially that any project funded under this bill that does not change the footprint of the pre-existing project, is basically a rehabbing of a pre-existing structure, does not need to start from scratch and go through an entirely new review under a long laundry list of federal statutes, Endangered Species Act, and you name it, okay? Well, that provoked a veto threat from the administration right away. They debated it on the floor. I think there was a threatened filibuster, so he withdrew it. They never voted on it. But the point, in a way, is when you look at these infrastructure projects, if you really want the money to do any good, try to make it, so that if it's something as simple as fixing up a bridge that's already in existence and you're not changing the footprint, you can do it in a relatively expedited way. You don't have to spend 4 or 5 years getting sequential approvals from one agency after another before you can even take the first step with the first contractor to put the first, coat of paint on a bridge or whatever it is. So some of the problem in the infrastructure spending has always been all the kind of rules and regulations that accompany it that stall it, and years and years go by before you start to notice any real impact, and that delays any economic result as well.
And I think on some of the infrastructure bills that are out there, it's the pork barrel projects, right? Everybody wants the bridge in their congressional district to be rebuilt. They want their roads rebuilt. So there's a lot of internal fighting in Congress about where that money is going to be allocated, which is sometimes what sinks some of the infrastructure funding. On the rules and regulations of infrastructure, I think that yes, I can see the point of if an existing project is there and the footprint is there, why have to start over? But look, if that bridge was built in the 1800s, maybe we should look at things. Things have changed. Maybe we should, look at some of the rules and regulations that are still out there. I don't think it needs to bog down the project, but I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, and maybe a compromise could be made that it gets expedited. And that's kind of some of the things that can move infrastructure projects forward. I think just on the touching base on the Detroit bailout, I think the bailout of the auto industry was a huge success. I think it's been an amazing time for the auto industry in general. I think you saw, or if you haven't seen, Tesla is overtaking, Ford and GM. I think that it's promoted competition. It's promoted everybody to change and everybody to, upgrade their cars and look at things that like Tesla is bringing to the table. And I think it's saved a fair amount of jobs. And I don't think that should be overlooked. So.
Yeah, the only thing I will add from, again, my seat in the arena is that in areas where there are higher unemployment rates, there are higher crime rates, and there are a lot of programs internationally that we're finding that people who identified and would go into violent extremism, one of the areas that would get them out of that is their identity would change because they would have a job. And so, and even some of those are minuscule jobs. Some who've attended my other lectures, I talked to one former Jamasami, a guy who became a duck plucker, and one who worked at a chocolate store. But that's how they identified themselves. So there is some value in that. I know working for the Navy Marine Corps, you never wanted idle hands, because that's when people get in trouble.
Switching gears a little bit here, interesting question. Can you elaborate on the causal link between opiate consumption and Obama's presidency, and what and what might have been Congress's role in the stats. And there's a second
Congress's
question.
role in what?
In the stats that you mentioned about the increase in opiate addiction. A second questioner, and this is a reminder that we're in Colorado, societal implications, big pharma, opiates versus medical marijuana, Schedule I classification. So not quite sure I can interpret that last question, but the relationship between these different approved and illegal drug systems.
The connection between President Obama and the opiate epidemic. This is something that, if you look at some of those trends I was talking about, really does go back. Okay, the thing I was trying to point out, the aspect of this I was trying to point out, is that nothing really changed along that trajectory. The negative trend line that had been getting worse over time continued to get worse. The opiate, the OxyContin aspect of that, actually, it did explode. And that was, I think, in part because of changes in practice by physicians in terms of what they wanted to prescribe. And this stuff is really, really toxically addictive. So, in answer to the marijuana aspect of this too, I've often thought when I've been on these panels before relating to drug legalization, the best way I can explain it is that we've, as a society, come to grips with alcohol. And I don't know what the number is, but out of every 1,000 or 100,000 people who take a taste of a beer or a glass of wine or a shot of whiskey, what number of them will become addicted, okay? And so we've managed to handle that ratio, whatever it is. Well, where does marijuana fit in on that? Where does OxyContin fit in? Heroin, cocaine? And at some point where that number is too large, really, to have it become something we can handle without some kind of controls and some kind of regulations. And I think, I tell my libertarian friends, free will is an element of libertarian thinking. It's sort of an essential assumption you make. Well, when you have something that's 25% addictive, 1 out of every 4 libertarians who samples OxyContin is going to become addicted, right? That takes away free will. And I think there's a point there where society does have a role to come in and try to build, some kind of protections around it. The problem we have with this epidemic is that the doctors profit from prescribing OxyContin. They do it like candy. They charge $3 for that copay under Medicaid. Medicaid is inadvertently subsidizing a lot of these purchases, and the folks who get it sometimes sell it on the street. Sometimes they just use it and become addicted, sometimes both. And a lot of them are on disability. And it's the time use, the Bureau of Labor Statistics studies on time use, you see that these people are on disability, they're getting a cash check, they get eventually Medicare coverage after 2 years on disability, and their time use is such that they're not doing a whole lot. They're not engaged in civic society, charitable work, that kind of stuff. They tend to watch things, they tend to play on machines, and it adds up to about 2,000 hours a year of watching TV, watching video games, playing video games, and playing around on their handheld devices. That's a full-time job. Yet they're getting the disability check. The disability now is at 4.5% of the adult population, and it started out, again, decades ago at about 1.5%. So it's been a steady increase over time with a couple of surges and 1 or 2 flat lines along that way, but it's been steady. So I guess my point is, on all these things, is that we're inheriting all these long-term negative trends in society that are causing a lot of societal problems. And it wasn't like the last 8 years there was any leadership in either chamber of Congress or in the White House to try to seriously grapple with it, and avoid all of the name calling that goes on every time you want to try to fix one of these programs.
And I think too on a lot of the things that are coming forward now, like opioid. If you doubt what a mainstream, addiction it's become, there was a ad on the Super Bowl, for constipation for opioids, and it's like that's where we are. But I think also too is that the internet has changed things. Before there was a lot of whether it was alcoholism, drug use, marijuana, things like that. A lot of stuff never got reported, never got talked about. we didn't have the widespread use of the internet, just a few years ago. And so things were maybe in the local paper or, talked about at coffee shops or, things like that. Maybe, somebody was tipping back a bottle or, took too many pills or something. But it wasn't talked about as widely as it is today. And I think that's another thing to think about, is that everybody has access to so much more information. Now you have you have access to Health and Human Services, reports on opioids, which, people really didn't have before. And so there's so much more information out there that makes it so much more mainstream and more talked about, as if, not that it hasn't increased, but as if it was just like this all of a sudden this new thing. And I think, prescription abuse has been around for a long time. And the opioids, especially with Oxycontin and things like that, are huge because they're so addictive, and there's such a market for them, outside of a prescription. So, let's not discount that it's not a new phenomenon. It's just we're learning much more about it.
And I'll speak again from my perspective, because I've purchased a lot of heroin, cocaine, and marijuana as an undercover agent in my day. Back in the day, now it's blood pressure medication and cholesterol medication that I'm purchasing now. Really, I need to really echo some of the things that Mike has said, because this plague of OxyContin is unlike anything that I've seen in my 40 years in law enforcement. So here's what's happening right now, which is troubling, because as we are increasing enforcement on this terribly addictive drug that is ruining lives of people, ruining families, increasing crime, what they're doing now is they're turning to heroin, because it's easier to get and it's cheaper, and other things. And so it's going to be a problem. And again, I speak as a crime fighter, a law enforcement officer, right? So they wind up getting societal problems. And so right now, police officers on the street are dealing with overdoses and other things, and you're seeing something created based on things that doctors were told was the magic pill, and would help you. And so it cuts across. The other drugs, when I was in the war on drugs, were more considered inner city drugs, with the heroin and things. And then, cocaine spread from the Hollywood drug to the inner cities. OxyContin, it doesn't matter. It's indiscriminate. It's young, it's the old, it's every race, color, and creed.
So a couple of related questions here. While Obama was president, same-sex marriage was legalized, and it felt like there was more acceptance of minorities and women. When Trump took office, racism and other things became okay. What are your thoughts in this? And I'll just tag one other question that came in. We haven't really touched the word environment. It says, please comment on the impact of the environment policies of the Obama presidency. So I'm kind of conjoining two different topics there.
I love our country, and I'm not entirely sure racism is okay. So I just want to put that out there. I think you are seeing or saw some acts of it. I don't think that's representative of all of us. I just don't think that we're a better country than that. And so I actually don't believe that statement that it's all of a sudden okay. I think that there are a finite amount of people who are capturing the headlines. And that's not okay. And I think things like marriage equality, fair pay for women, the Hate Crimes Act, things like that, have all moved this country forward and are in line with what the majority of Americans and how the majority of Americans think, and where they are philosophically. But I do not actually think that it's okay. And I think there's just a finite amount of people who are capturing those headlines. I think you're starting to see people fight back, not physically, But, there was a story not too long ago, I want to say it was about maybe 3 weeks ago, that some folks in New York City had walked into the subway and somebody had written swastikas all over the inside of the subway. And everybody banded together, and this woman had said, hand sanitizer takes off Sharpies. And so they had all banded together to wipe them all off on the inside of the subway. I think that is what our country's about. I think a lot of this stuff has always been there. Swastikas or hate crimes or, things like that. Look no further than, just up north in Wyoming with Matthew Shepard. I think a lot of the hate crimes have been there. Getting back to how information is spread now, we're hearing more about it, and it's more instant. It's an Instagram post that gets posted and shared widely, or a tweet that goes viral and is breaking news, and people retweet it, and don't always or just it happens so fast now because we're in such a 24-hour instant news cycle. And so I do think that our country is better than accepting racism and saying it's okay now. I think things have changed philosophically. That's what you get when there's a Democrat and a Republican. And so, the Republican Party's in power now. And with that comes some change in social ideas. And so, and social movements and social agenda that's pushed forward. But it doesn't mean that things are okay. And so I'm going to push back on that one a little bit, but I do think that, you've seen some crimes and some acts of just a finite amount of people that capture, the headlines that aren't necessarily representative of, of the entire Republican Party. I'm not a fan of defending the Republican Party, just so you know. But I don't think it's fair to lump everybody into that group. I just think that we're better than that.
I'd like to say real quick that just going back to some of the polling numbers, that when they asked about relations between whites and blacks and I think Hispanics and so on, some of those polling questions, I think Pew does a lot of that, did find mostly in the aftermath of what happened in Ferguson and Dallas and New York and some other places, that those numbers went in the wrong direction. So there was a sense that relations have been getting worse. I think it's calmed down in that regard in the last year or so. I think those numbers have gotten more where they had been prior to that. But all those incidents in both directions, both police shooting unarmed people and armed people shooting police, obviously with all the media coverage created quite a strong impression that, where is this all coming from? And things that had been kind of relegated to the 1960s footage reel were coming back into our living rooms every night for a while. And that caused some negative feelings.
Well, let me just talk about my concerns with the trend line right now in this area. Last year in October 2016, I'm a member of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, largest organization of police chiefs in the world, 27,000 members. And we had our annual conference in San Diego, California, just this October. And the president of IACP, I think we had about 16 or 17,000 law enforcement officers descend upon the city of San Diego. And I commented to the citizens, you are either the safest or most riskiest community we have in the United States, with a bunch of beer and police officers. But Chief Terry Cunningham, the president of IACP, basically, on behalf of the IACP, apologized to communities of color for the role that police may have had in contributing to the problems, and to ovations from the police executives from around the world in the audience. And that was a monumental step, and not a very popular one, frankly, with some of the rank and file and others who feel under attack in these communities, and we don't have enough time to debate that. But just recently something happened that does concern me about the trend line. One of the things used to try to correct those problems is a thing called a consent decree. And so what happens in places like Ferguson or other areas, Newark, New Jersey right now, when things seem to be at such a level that they require the federal government to intercede, the Department of Justice comes in and issues a consent decree and establishes what needs to be done in milestones and other things, and sends monitors to ensure that there is a compliance with what is agreed upon to approve those departments. Well, our current Attorney General, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, the third, has come out and said that we want all of these re-reviewed, because he was concerned that may be impacting kind of the local police officer and their feelings that they are under attack. And believe me, that's not the view of the police executives that I know. And there was one issued in Baltimore, and they tried to withdraw that, and the police chief there said, you know what, we want to do this anyway. We understand our department needs we have problems. We need the help. We're trying to get better. So I'm concerned in these areas that, and the Attorney General wants to review all those other ones that are on the shelf here and take a hard look. And so the message, the cascading message that sends to the rank and file who might not even agree what their executives are trying to do from a leadership and strategy perspective is a little bit concerning, because the Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer in the land, is sending a message that may be inconsistent with what executives want to do.
So we're pretty much out of time. I'm going to take the privilege and ask one more question, or it's a little group of questions. Ellie, what was your favorite moment, day, event while you were at the White House? Or another question was, can you share any stories about your relationship with the Obamas? Or what do you know about the Obama Foundation? Or the most important question of the day, how many eggs were involved in the Easter egg roll?
There were 15,000 eggs in the Easter egg roll. I can tell you that one. You know, the Obama Foundation, just kind of tick backwards a little bit, is, you know, they're starting to define themselves now. I think the president has been focused on starting his book, and they're starting to, you know, start the chapter or start the infrastructure of the foundation and exactly, you know, where it's going to go, what it's going to do, things like that. So they're just very much in their infantile stages right now. As for the White House, you know, I have a couple fun events, and I think one of the most meaningful days of my life was we had a Make-A-Wish child come in, and she was about 4 or 5 years old. She met with the president in the Oval Office, and after the meeting, I walked she and her father back to their car, and her father gave me a big hug. And he said, you probably, you know, I can't thank you enough. He said, you probably added a few months to my daughter's life. And I think, you know, those moments that you have are just absolutely, you know, amazing. You know, for my relationship with the Obamas, I've been with them for over 10 years. I think they're amazing, amazing people. Big fan, so I'm a big thanks Obama person. So, you know, and I appreciate all the risks that they've taken, all of the, and I appreciate this really from any politician, whether I agree with them or not. They put themselves out there, and whether your opinion is popular or not, you put yourself out there and you fight for what you believe in. And I appreciate that. I think the First Lady, Michelle Obama, has done amazing things with her Let's Move initiative and healthy eating and, you know, exercising for kids and, you know, bringing a lot of the programs back and community gardens back for, you know, schools. You know, I think the president, you know, everything from, you know, I see that. Wow, that was it, huh? So anyway, I think they're amazing people. So I'm in the thanks Obama category.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm in the thanks to all of you category for coming here and being with us today. Thank you very much.